we've talked about the amnesia that people suffer when it comes to, or cultural amnesia that people suffer when it comes to dissolution. When people are able to offer a view of the dissolution, so I'll offer one as an example, then perhaps you can tell me commonly how people come to think of them and the truths, the mistruths, the half truths in there. Some would say Henry VIII and his heavies came round and shuttered them all, and before that they were all thriving, and then it was like I think you referred to it in the book as like the authority of the crown comes down and fells a forest, one fell swoop. Others would perhaps say that the monks were corrupt and crooked and skimming off the top. And then there are others who are more sympathetic, who would say that it was a spiritual paradise, highly productive industrially, a place of great learning and cultural production, and it was nothing but a travesty that they were all closed down under the authority of the crown. What do you think the most common view is amongst the people that you rub shoulders with, and what do you think the reality is?
Okay, I think today in the early 21st century, the most common prevailing view of those who've given any thought to this is your first interpretation. In other words, that this is a centralizing monarchy, a super ambitious monarch whose own material resources, whose own finances are inadequate to satisfy his ambitions. I think it's well understood that Henry VIII is ambitious not only to secure his dynasty with a male heir, but ambitious to compete on a European stage as a Renaissance monarch. He's conscious that, measured up against Francis I of France, and certainly against the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, that England and his English monarchy looks like a poor relation. He doesn't have the resources of those monarchies in order to compete adequately and to be recognized as a major European power. And he's looking to find a means of powering towards those ambitious goals, and turns to the private wealth of monastery foundations in order to do that. I think that's a view not just of the sort of general interest in Tudor history, but of perhaps still some working historians. It's replaced the view that prevailed, I think, through much of the 18th, 19th, and even early 20th centuries, which is of the monasteries as essentially a reactionary force, personally, individually corrupt and self-serving, but collectively also a sort of blight on the body politic, a sort of an obstacle to the emergence of a kind of much more modern state. And the early generations of professional historians in the latter part of the 19th century, they weren't so preoccupied with the idea of corrupt and depraved monks. But they were entirely sold on the notion of a sort of positivist march through time, that in order for the English kingdom to become what they knew it to be at the end of Victoria's reign, this all-powerful institutionalized state, it needed to get over these old medieval trappings and to shake them off. And so it seemed natural to them to interpret the dissolution not so much about money, not so much about grasping ambition, but rather about a sort of necessary cleansing of the state, of its older and less progressive elements, a kind of purgative process. To my mind, neither of these are, of course, are satisfactory. I think I'd hope that no working historian today would buy into such a sort of positivist, what used to be called Whig notion of a kind of march through time of a triumphant English state. I also think that we've come, thankfully, a long way away from what also marked that Victorian view of corrupt monasticism, which was still touched by a kind of anti-Catholicism, a sort of intolerance of Catholic practice. I think when it comes to toleration of different faiths, early 21st century Britain is in a very different position to a century and a half ago. But I also think that the notion of Henry VIII setting out on a sort of a plan to deliver a windfall financially that enables him to fulfill his ambitions. It simply is out of step with what the documentation reveals to us, that there's no denying Henry's ambition, but it is a very unfocused, very changeable agenda. Henry is mutable, suggestible. All of the people who lived and worked around him, who knew him best, and who have left us comments in personal letters and notes of various kind, the most powerful common thread running through all of that documentation is that we never quite know where the king's mind is going to go next. So, yes, he wanted to compete on a European stage. Yes, he was well aware that his ambition did not match his wherewithal, his resources. But he is not the personality capable of setting objectives, devising a strategy, and then working towards it. And what I see in reading the documentary record of this period is a constant shifting and changing of plan, of strategy, of direction, quite simply. And at the heart of that, and I think one of the main reasons that Henry is such a mutable, suggestible character, is something that possibly goes to the very roots of his makeup, his personality, which is a man who is very uncertain about who his allies are. A man who has carried into his reign and his adulthood something which must be an inheritance from his father, which is a strong and persisting awareness that the Tudor regime was seized. It wasn't succeeded to peaceably, but it was secured only on the battlefield. And that what his father won could easily be lost. And that the framework that underpins it is potentially quite flimsy. And I think this is why we see through the later 1520s and into the 1530s and even beyond it, the 1540s, these otherwise pretty surprising changes of mood, changes of tone, changes of direction in policy, because Henry never quite arrives at a place where he feels secure about being able to carry the necessary allies, supporters with him in order to take the next step. And so we don't see him establishing a blueprint and going on to implement his plan, but rather we see him almost sort of nudging in one direction and seeing what response it gets, and then nudging in another direction. It's very comparable to, arguably, a period of British government that we've all just recently lived through, where you have increasingly the implementation of government based on or driven by a real lack of confident certainty as to what your electorate really will buy into. And so you have sometimes apparently quite contradictory gestures. Are we going to toss something towards business whilst at the same time taking measures that seem to run against the instinctive interests of business, because we are having to broker a base of support and we're not 100% confident about any of the constituencies from which we can build that support. I think that's to a great extent what we see in the 1530s. And it's amplified by a personal awareness in Henry of his father's inheritance, as I say, of a regime that is very young, that is only where it is because of success on the battlefield, and which is now, as Henry is entering middle age at the beginning of the 1530s, is also looking increasingly vulnerable because the succession is uncertain as well. So it cannot be, and the documents don't bear it out, it cannot be that he sets out on a plan to take all of this money and achieve what he wants to achieve. Equally, of course, this is not a sort of building of a modern state in a linear way. It's like so much in our history. It's more unpredictable and more surprising than either of those two lines of argument.